The Problem of God by Mark Clark. Chapter 4. The Problem of the Christ Myth. One difference between God's work and man's is that while God's work cannot mean more than he meant, man's must mean more than he meant. It is God's things, his embodied thoughts, which alone a man has to use, modified and adopted to his own purposes. So many the facts hinted in every symbol, a man may well himself discover truth in what he wrote, for he was dealing all the time with things that came from thoughts beyond his own. George MacDonald, The Fantastic Imagination. I was talking to one of my neighbors recently. He knows I'm a pastor, and he said to me, "I really respect what you do, Mark, trying to help people and all, but I think it's all based on a lie. We all know now that Jesus never really existed." I was a bit surprised to hear him say this, so I asked him to explain what he meant. As if he were reading a script, he unpacked for me what has become known as the Christ myth. Jesus is just a made-up person, he said, a myth modeled after Horus, Dionysus, and a number of other mythological ancient gods whose stories predate Jesus by thousands of years. You Christians ignore it and continue to believe and promote one of the greatest deceptions of all time. Christianity is the greatest story ever sold. This is an extremely popular view today. My neighbor and many others believe the church invented Jesus, modeling him after existing myths about dying and rising gods that heal people, walk on water, feed thousands, have 12 disciples, and then die, get buried for 3 days, and rise again. I encounter it often when I speak publicly about Christianity or even just walk down the streets of Vancouver. In our city, people have booths and hand out Christ myth literature. My neighbor cited several books and films produced in the last 10 to 15 years that have popularized this challenge to Christianity. The most popular of which include The Pagan Christ by Tom Harper, Canada's best-selling book in 2004, The Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy, The Christ Conspiracy and Christ in Egypt by Achariah S. films such as Zeitgeist, Religious, and The God Who Wasn't There also present the case for the Christ myth in a creative and convincing way. Maybe the most notable is the film Zeitgeist, extremely popular among college students across North America. Written and directed by Peter Joseph, it claims about Jesus, also echoed in Bill Maher's film Religious, are significant and would be devastating to Christianity if they were proven true. So what do we do with these increasingly popular challenge? As with any conspiracy theory, I find that it helps to slow down, pause the tape, and look at facts. Let's start with where this idea originated. The first modern attempt to deny the historical existence of Jesus can be traced back to the late 18th century in the work of two French writers, Constantin Francis de Chasseboeuf, Comte de Volney, and Charles Francisco Dupuis. They argued that Christianity is simply an amalgamation of various ancient mythologies and that Jesus Christ was constructed by the church as another mythical character in the same mold as hundreds of other stories told throughout history in different cultures. These claims have achieved success at the popular level, so how does one respond? First, we must realize that these claims are not taken seriously by legitimate scholars. Even scholarly skeptics such as Bart D. Ehrman, who do not accept many of the religious claims of Christianity, agree that Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure who really existed. Historians continue to debate the nature of Jesus, the exact date of his birth, what he did and taught, etc., but they almost unanimously affirm that he existed. It's an accepted fact, which is why H.G. Wells famously summarized the consensus this way: I am a historian, I am not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that the penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history. So why are there still doubts? Because the Christ myth is regularly told to a susceptible culture by those who would have us believe it. The Christ myth itself. What is the Christ myth in its entirety? One of the most widely read proponents, Akira S., summarizes it this way in her book, The Christ Conspiracy. Jesus Christ is a mythical character based on various ubiquitous God-men and universal saviors who were part of the ancient world for thousands of years prior to the Christian era. Believers in the idea attempt to demonstrate that Horus, Mithras, Dionysus, and many other figures of ancient mythology have precise parallels with Christ, making his claims illegitimate, including the following: 12 disciples being born of a virgin on December 25th, Magi visiting their birthplaces after following a star to the east, miracles, walking on water, feeding many, disciples beheaded, crucified, and after 3 days rising again. Brian Fleming, the writer and director of The God Who Wasn't There, contends that the early Christians knew Jesus wasn't real. He was just a good idea. The Apostle Paul didn't even pretend that Jesus was a historical person, but simply established a new spiritual, not historical, worldview. This is why Paul focuses on being in Christ and in the Spirit, instead of urging a pattern of discipleship by following the life of Jesus as a historical figure. So how should we respond to these assertions? As I hinted earlier, the Christ myth falls apart with just a little amount of historical study. First, we'll look at the question of whether Jesus ever existed. Then we'll examine the supposed parallels between Jesus and the pagan gods. Did Jesus exist? At least 10 first-century historians and writers outside the Bible mention Jesus of Nazareth by name. Some of them Jewish, some Roman, most not friends of the Christian faith at all. Indeed, they frequently had an anti-Christian agenda. Here are 2 examples. Tacitus. Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Tacitus Annals 15.44. Josephus. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the 3rd day he appeared, restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared. Josephus, Antiquities 18.63 through 64. Secular writers such as these make some of the same claims about Jesus that the New Testament makes. They say that he was a charismatic leader and that Jews and the Romans killed him, that his disciples claim that he was resurrected from the dead after he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that his early followers worshipped him as God, resulting in their own torture and death. Which leads us to a second reason the Christ myth theory lacks credibility. Under the persecution of both the Jews and the Roman Empire, Christianity grew from a group of 12 disciples to over 33 million people in just 350 years. And by 400 AD, 56% of the entire population of the Roman Empire were Christians. Why did it grow so fast? Why were men and women, even close family and friends, so willing to die for Christianity? The logical explanation for this runs contrary to the Christ myth. Jesus' followers died because they claimed that they had seen Jesus rise from the dead. They were persecuted and tortured and told to recant this claim, but they never did. They died for it. They weren't dying for a set of metaphorical religious teachings or principles of life taught them by a dead sage, but for a revolutionary historical claim, what had happened to Jesus after he died. In a long section of one of his letters, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-49, the Apostle Paul makes it very clear that Jesus and the resurrection were historical facts. He was raised, verse 4, and even goes out of his way to make the point that if this claim were just a religious or mythological idea, then Christianity is false, a waste of time, and Christians are to be the most pitied people in the world. Verse 19. A scandalous historical fact as Christians were not afraid to die for their belief in the historical Jesus. They weren't afraid of being tortured, sawn in half, stretched apart, thrown to the lions in gladiators' arenas, or stoned to death in the street. They never recanted their testimony about Jesus, and that conviction, courage, and hope caused the gospel to spread rapidly. In fact, the rise of the early church is one of the anomalies of history, that the largest religion in the world arose so quickly from a single man and his 12 followers, often at the cost of their own lives, has caused many skeptics to face another reality. Not only did Jesus live, but he really did rise from the dead. Taking on the Christ myth. There are also several problems with the myth itself and those who argue for it on a popular and scholarly level. First, the proponents of the myth rarely, if ever, do one of the major things that good historians do, which is interacting with the primary sources. For example, if you write a university paper on Romeo and Juliet, but you don't quote the Shakespearean text itself, only citing secondary sources or papers written about Shakespeare, you will likely get a failing grade. The primary sources that need evaluation in our case are the Gospels themselves and the ancient texts that contain the myths of Horus, Attis, Mithras, and others. Yet when you read books or watch films about the Christ myth, it is quickly apparent that the authors and filmmakers have not interacted with the primary sources at all. They simply cite modern authors who agree with their conclusions. For instance, Akira S. claims that Horus had 12 disciples long before Jesus did. Her footnote to this claim is not a citation of an ancient scroll or well-known Egyptian narrative, as one might expect, but the writings of a man named Gerald Massey. But if you read Massey's book, The Historical Jesus and the Mythical Christ, while he claims that Horus had 12 disciples, he doesn't cite any one or any text, ancient or modern, that supports his claim. Moreover, there is no recognized Egyptologists who accept this claim. A mention of Horus's 12 disciples is not found in the Book of the Dead, nor is it contained within the hieroglyphs of Egypt. Furthermore, the Christ myth loses credibility because it gets the facts wrong, not only about the ancient myths, but about Christianity itself. For instance, Zeitgeists make several claims about the symbolic number 12 that are flatly untrue. The movie says that the Bible borrows the significance of 12 from the pagan 12-month calendar, which originally was connected to the movement of stars and the zodiac. It also claims that in the Bible, there are 12 tribes of Israel, 12 princes, 12 kings, and 12 judges. The truth of the matter, however, is that though the Bible does use the number 12, it never mentions 12 princes, 12 kings, or 12 judges. There are far more than 12 of each of these in the scriptures. In addition, the Christ myth advocates make several factual errors when examining the so-called parallels they draw between Jesus and the major mythological persons. Consider the earlier claim that Horus had 12 disciples. The primary sources, in this case Egyptian hieroglyphs, illustrate that Horus only had 4 disciples. In one place, the sources show that he may have had as many as 16. but never does the number 12 appear. Tom Harper, seen as a scholarly representative of the Christ myth, goes even further and claims that Horus was a fisherman with 12 disciples. But again, he cites no sources for his claims. Who were the 4 accepted followers or disciples of Horus? The primary sources point to a turtle, a bear, a lion, and a tiger. But to say that this has any connection to Jesus or his disciples is more than a stretch. These followers of Horus are not in any kind of relationship with Horus, nor do they become emissaries of his message in any way like disciples of Jesus did. Over and over again, the facts are misinterpreted and skewed to force parallels with Christianity. In the end, it comes down to one simple question. Are there any direct parallels between Jesus Christ and these popular ancient gods? And if so, does Christianity crumble under the weight of them? Let's look at the most cited Christ parallels. Horus, Mithras, Dionysus, Attis, and Krishna. Mercy. Horus. We've already talked about Horus, who is arguably the main character in this debate. Horus was one of the oldest and most significant deities in ancient Egypt, worshipped from early in Egyptian history right up to the Greco-Roman period. Here are the claims of parallels with Christianity. 1. Horus was born of a virgin on December 25th. 2. He was born in a manger. 3. 3 kings followed a star in the east to his birth. 4. He was a child teacher by the age of 12. 5. He was baptized in a river by Anup, who was later beheaded. 6. He had 12 disciples. He was a fisherman. He was crucified between 2 thieves, and he was raised from the dead after 3 days. So, was Horus's mother a virgin? If we look at the story of Horus's conception and birth, we learn that his mother's name was Isis, and his father was Osiris. Prior to Horus's conception, Osiris was in the fight with another god, during which he was killed and chopped into several pieces. In order to conceive Horus, Isis gathered up pieces of Osiris's body and conceived Horus by hovering over his severed phallus. To call this a parallel to the virgin conception and virgin birth of Jesus is a stretch to say the least. Secondly, Horus does not share a birthday with Jesus. While one of the 3 birth dates on record for Horus is December 25th, we must understand that Jesus was not born on December 25th. The celebration of Jesus' birth on that day in the modern Western world was started by Pope Julius I in the 4th century AD to challenge the pagan celebration of the Roman god Saturnalia, which was held on December 25th. Scholars do not know the exact date of Jesus' birth, but they posit that Jesus was most likely born in September or October. The point is that the early Christians did not craft Jesus to replace Horus by selecting December 25th. In addition, there is no credible historical evidence to suggest that Horus was born in a manger. Akira S. claims this in her book, but there is no source evidence cited to support a manger birth for Horus. Furthermore, the idea that Horus and Jesus' births were announced by a star in the east and attended by 3 kings is deceiving. As the story is told, multiple ancient myths speak of 3 kings who attended a birth of significance. This is a reference to the constellation Orion, since there are 3 main stars that make up Orion's belt, as well as a lead star, and the 3 stars are commonly called the 3 kings. In other words, these 3 kings follow the lead star to the birth of a cosmic savior. Skeptics argue that the New Testament writers are writing Jesus' story to reflect this astrology, but there is one small problem with this theory. It is now commonly accepted that no one spoke of the typology of 3 kings following a lead star in astrology until the 19th century. It would be impossible for the Gospel writers to have based their story off this idea, because the story hadn't been even invented yet. In addition, it's worth pointing out that Christianity never claims that there were 3 kings present at the birth of Jesus. This is a common misconception attached to our celebration of Christmas. Instead, the Bible tells us that the men who came to visit Jesus were magi, not kings. Matthew 2:1. Magi were Babylonian or Persian astrologers and magicians, and the Bible never claims there were 3 of them. Matthew, the only gospel writer who recounts the story of these traveling men who followed a star to find Jesus, only tells us that they brought gold and frankincense and myrrh. Matthew 2:11. There were 3 gifts, but no evidence to suggest that there was only 1 man for each gift. There could have been 2, or there could have been 20. Furthermore, contrary to popular Christian legend, these men were not at the actual birth of Jesus. The story says they arrived at the house and saw the child. Matthew 2, verse 11. The Magi were not at the inn. Luke 2:7. As in the account of the shepherds, nor was Jesus a baby. The Greek word for child in Matthew 2:11 means toddler, not baby. Given that Matthew tells us that Herod killed all the children less than 2 years of age in his slaughter, it is likely that the Magi arrived when Jesus was around 2 years old, not on the night of his birth. Matthew 2:16. This is nothing new. Christian scholars have pointed this out for years. There is also no evidence to support the claims that Horus was a child teacher in a temple by the age of 12, or that Anup baptized him and was later beheaded. These claims are, again, found in the writings of Gerald Massey, and when scholars asked Massey about the source of his claims, he said he had read them in the Book of the Dead. Egyptologists challenged him on this, pointing out that such claims are not made in the Book of the Dead, and Massey eventually admitted that he couldn't remember where he had read them. Finally, Horus was not crucified between 2 thieves and resurrected from the dead 3 days later. In most of the Horus stories, he doesn't die at all. There is only one questionable story in which he does die. In that story, he is cut into pieces by an enemy and then thrown into water. The resurrection parallel is similarly flawed, the closest thing to a parallel being that he is fished out of the water by crocodiles. Mithras. Another mythological figure frequently cited as a Christ parallel is the Roman god Mithras. Most of what is known of Mithras is taken from ancient reliefs and sculptures produced about Mithraism, a mystery religion practiced in the Roman Empire, particularly within the Roman military, from about the 1st to 4th centuries AD. The parallels between Mithras and Christ are similar to some with Horus. 1. Mithras was born of a virgin on December 25th. 2. Shepherds attended his birth. 3. He had 12 disciples. 4. He was buried in a tomb and 3 days later rose from the dead. Let's look at each of these claims in order. While the birth of Mithras may have been celebrated on December 25th, he was not born of a virgin. The story is that he was born fully formed out of a rock with the dagger in one hand and a torch in the other. Is that a virgin birth? I don't know. How does one assess the sexual activity of a rock? Mithras' story does tell of shepherds present at his birth who helped dig him out of the rock face. Again, however, there is a simple problem with the claim that the early Christians built a Christ myth from this. The earliest of the Mithras stories that we have are dated 200 years after the Gospels were written. This is why scholars are quick to point out that the most likely scenario is that stories from Greco-Roman mythology borrowed from Christianity, in this instance, not the other way around. Early church writers Tertullian from 160 to 220 AD and Justin Martyr 100 to 165 AD make this very point when they address the Mithraic cults of their time, arguing that certain practices in the cult, among them baptism and communion, are copying Christian symbols. Mithras also did not have 12 disciples, as some claim. There are two versions of the Mithras legend. In the Persian version, Mithras has one disciple. In the Roman version, he has two. Mithras was never buried in a tomb and resurrected 3 days later. There is, in fact, no record of Mithras dying in any of the mythological material. Dionysus, a third supposed parallel with Jesus, is the Greek god Dionysus, the god of wine, and it is claimed that Dionysus was, like Horus and Mithras, born of a virgin on December 25th, that he also rose from the dead. As we saw with Horus, the birth date parallel has a simple historically verifiable explanation, unrelated to supposed parallels with Christ. But what about the claim of a virgin birth? According to scholars, Dionysus was conceived when the Greek god Zeus impregnated his own mother, Semele, by becoming a lightning bolt and striking her. Later, the goddess Hera tricked Semele and caused her to be burnt to a crisp. The prenatal Dionysus was left sitting on the ground. Well, certainly a spectacular story, this is not a virgin birth. And as with the other stories, Dionysus also did not rise from the dead. The story is that when he was an infant, a gang of Titans attacked him and ate him, everything but his heart. This they left sitting on the ground. Zeus later came down, destroyed the Titans, and then restored Dionysus to life from his own heart. Some cite this as a clear parallel with Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, but the parallels are weak. A man rising again from death after being crucified and a God being restored to life from his own heart aren't exactly the same story. Again, this is stretching facts far beyond what is warranted, all to fit a preconceived narrative. Attis. Another mythological character cited as a Christological figure is Attis, a Greek god of vegetation, whose death and resurrection represented the fruits of the earth, which die in winter only to rise again in the spring. Christ myth proponents claim that Attis was born of a virgin, crucified on a tree to redeem the earth, and resurrected from the dead. Again, when we look at their evidence, we find that Attis was not born of a virgin. His mother conceived him when a male god put his semen on a piece of fruit, which she ate, leading to conception. While interesting and strange, this isn't a virgin conception. Parallel with Christianity. While Attis's mother may or may not have been a virgin, this is quite different from the virgin conception of Jesus Christ. The Bible never speaks of the semen of God impregnating Mary or anything close. What of the claim that Attis was crucified on a tree to redeem the earth? There are two recorded versions of his death. In the first, Attis is killed while hunting when another hunter accidentally hits him with a spear. The second, more popular version is the story begins at Attis's wedding, when his disapproving father, Agdistis, arrives and it causes chaos that results in a stampede of people and the trampling of Attis's bride. Attis, upset with his father, rips off his own genitals, runs from the wedding, and dies under a pine tree. So yes, a tree is involved, and yes, there is blood, but that's as far as the parallel goes. There is no talk of redeeming the world or crucifixion. Attis is not resurrected from the dead. After the death, his father pleads with Zeus to raise Attis, but Zeus declares he can't. Instead, Zeus causes Attis's hair to grow perpetually and his pinky finger to move continuously. Call me crazy, but I think it's safe to say that this is not a parallel with the resurrection of Jesus. Krishna. The final parallel we need to consider is Krishna. There is one parallel drawn between the famous Indian god Krishna and Christ, and that is the claim that he was born of a virgin. However, according to legend, Krishna had 7 siblings before he was born. Moreover, the claim regarding his miraculous conception is that a white elephant impregnated his mother. Again, While this sounds spectacular, it is not a virgin conception at all. All of this is to show that when we look closely at the so-called parallels with Christianity, we find that they are not parallels at all. There are a few details that are similar to these pagan religions and Christianity, but those that are somewhat similar are very loose connections. Several actually came later than Christianity and borrowed from Christianity rather than the other way around. JFK versus Abraham Lincoln. This is not to suggest that there are no parallels between Christianity and the religions that came before it. Christianity does not claim to be the first religion to speak of the concept of God's becoming human, dying, and then being resurrected. In a general sense, there are other religious beliefs rooted in stories that share these themes. So what does a Christian say about parallels that predate Christ? First, we need to be careful to avoid what Craig Evans calls parallelomania. This is where authors perceive similarities between events or people and then construct parallels without any attention to cultural context or historical awareness. I once heard someone talk about the similarities between the lives and deaths of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. He pointed out that both men were concerned with civil rights. Both were elected to Congress in 1846 and 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both were slain on a Friday before a major holiday. Both were shot in the presence of their wives and another couple. Of the other couple, the man was wounded, but neither wife was. Both were shot from behind in the head. Lincoln was shot in the Ford's Theater in Box 7. Kennedy was shot in Car 7 of the Dallas motorcade. Both were pronounced dead at a location with the initials PH, Peterson House and Parkland Hospital. The successors of both men were named Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808 and Lyndon B. Johnson in 1908. Both assassins were privates in the military. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Booth fled from a theater to a library, while Oswald fled from a library to a theater. Both assassins were taken into custody by a police officer named Baker. Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Ford car. The model of the Ford was a Lincoln. The parallels are uncanny, but no scholar believes that because of these similarities, there is any legitimate connection between the lives and deaths of these two men. And on top of that, nobody questions the existence of John F. Kennedy because he came after Abraham Lincoln. In the same way, it's just not reasonable to question the life and death of Jesus, even if there are some parallels with other mythological figures. And if there are parallels, what if there is a far more compelling explanation for why they exist than the explanations offered by skeptics, that Jesus is a myth, or Christians, that Satan weaved himself into pagan thought, so that when Christianity arose, it looked like a myth? What if nothing could be more natural in the plan of God than the existence of such stories? The true myth. In Romans 2:14-16, the Apostle Paul says that the Spirit of God writes his law in the hearts of all people. This explains why people who aren't Christians still possess convictions of right and wrong. Augustine of Hippo writes about this when he speaks directly to the pagan Celsus. Celsus had argued that it seemed as though God took no care of people in past times. Augustine disagreed, saying, "This very thing which is now called the Christian religion existed before. It was not absent from the beginning of the human race until Christ himself came in the flesh. But it was then the true religion that already existed began to be called Christian." We find within Christian thought a concept of a pre-Christian form of Christianity, a cruciform pattern built into the fabric of human history. This is similar to what the Apostle Paul suggests in his letter to the Colossians. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, he says, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Colossians 2:16-17, emphasis added. Religious practices involving food and drink, or the celebration of festivals, were a shadow and anticipation of Christ, who later arrives and supplies the shadows with substance. The ancient myths, symbols, and festivals were God-given anticipations of the Christian story that prepared people to respond to the good news of Jesus. God, by his grace, used culture, myths, and legends to prepare humankind to hear and understand the gospel. This is exactly the position that the modern novelist J.R.R. Tolkien held, and is, interestingly, how he convinced fellow Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis to become a Christian. Lewis was a scholar of medieval literature who loved the elevating and exciting nature of medieval adventure stories. He believed that the myths and legends gave meaning, beauty, and joy to the world. But he also recognized that they were not true. History, on the other hand, while true, harbored no inherent meaning or beauty for Lewis. It related facts but did not imply purpose or design. Lewis's problem was that men derived more spiritual meaning from myths they do not believe are true than from the religions they professed. As an unbeliever, he feared that if Christianity were true, then the old stories and myths he loved so dearly were wholly false. Lies breathed through silver, he said, exciting and full of beauty maybe, but ultimately worthless. One of his primary objections to Christianity was that it would steal his joy. Tolkien showed Lewis that the opposite was true, that the Christian understanding of the world gave equal weight to both of Lewis's passions, reason and romanticism. In his biography on Lewis, Alistair McGath recounts the story of Lewis and Tolkien's fascinating conversation about this very topic in September 1931. Both men were professors at University of Oxford, and they were strolling with their friend Hugo Dyson along the famous Addison's Walk at Magdalen College. All belonged to a group called the Inklings, who would meet at a local pub, the Eagle and Child, to drink and share their writings with one another. It was here that some of the most beloved literature of the 20th century was first read aloud and shared, including The Lord of the Rings and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. On that September evening, Lewis relayed to his close friends his acceptance of the idea of God, clarifying that this was a conversation only to theism, pure and simple, not to Christianity. Yet 12 days later, Lewis wrote to his friend Arthur Greeves, saying, I have just passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it. What happened that night that convinced Lewis to accept Christianity is true. Tolkien pointed out that myth and history are not all that removed from each other, that Lewis's problem lay not in his rational failure to understand God, as he had already acknowledged his existence, but in his imaginative failure to grasp God's significance, that a worldview that included the story of Christ gave life more meaning, adventure, and romance, not less. Just as speech is invention about objects and ideas, so myth is invention about truth, he told himself. We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Our myths may be misguided, but they steer, however, shakily towards the true harbor. In other words, instead of being wholly false or purely satanic distractions, the stories Lewis cherished were shadows, anticipations of the full truth. Lewis wondered if Christianity was just another myth and whether the Gospels were merely fairy tales. Tolkien explained that, in a way, they were, with their miraculous births, adventures, heroes, and happy endings. But there was one critical difference. They were true. They actually happened. Christianity was the best of both worlds. It was fairy story incarnate, legend and history meeting as one. Christianity was, Tolkien said, the one and only place where transcendence, the joy myths created in us, and the reality of history collide. And so Romanticism and rationalism together were the paths on which Lewis came to Christ. Lewis came to believe this deeply, concluding that at their best, the Christ-shaped stories of the pagan world were a real, though unfocused, gleam of divine truth falling on human imagination. The old myth of the dying god comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth to history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, from Osiris dying, nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified. It is all in order, under Pontius Pilate. It says, Christ is more than Osiris, not less. We must not be ashamed of the parallels. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. Those who do not know that this great myth became fact when the Virgin conceives are indeed to be pitied. When we try to force parallels between Christianity and the pagan stories, we run the danger of minimizing the clear differences. But there is an opposite danger as well. Myths have their place in human history as expressions of a deep yearning in our consciousness, a universal witness to the hunger and hope that God would come into intimate contact with humankind, repair the damages made by our sinfulness, and grant a safety that would last forever. In the gospel we see that this is exactly what God has done. In other words, we told ourselves these stories until they became true. Conclusion. If we look at the evidence honestly and do not get lost in conspiracy theories, I believe it leads us unwaveringly to confirm the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth, that he was a real flesh and blood Jewish teacher in first century Israel, and anything but a mythological projection or reappropriation of ancient legends, astrological stories. In this, we are in agreement with the majority of historical scholarship and avoid falling into unsupported theories based on unwarranted assumptions and unchallenged agendas.